They were found lying side by side, a gun between them, their bodies still warm when the maid entered the room. A teacher and his student. The note beside them, written in shaky hands, read, "If we can't be together in this world, we'll find another." But was it really love? Or was it something much darker? This is the story of Daniel Reeves, a 34-year-old high school English teacher, and Hannah Caldwell, an 18-year-old student with dreams of escaping her small town. Together, they fled across the country, running from the law, from scandal, and from a reality that neither of them could truly escape. But their journey ended in room 306 of a rundown motel, where a gunshot shattered the silence of the night. By sunrise, their names were on every news channel, their faces plastered across headlines. What drove them to this point? Was it love? Manipulation? Obsession? As we unravel the details of this case, one thing becomes clear. This was never a love story. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. 6 months earlier, Brookhaven High School was just another ordinary institution in a small Midwestern town. The kind where nothing ever happened, until it did. Hannah was a bright student, known for her sharp mind and rebellious streak. She dreamed of leaving town, of chasing something bigger than the life her parents expected her to settle for. Daniel Reeves was respected, charismatic, intelligent, and the kind of teacher students trusted. But beneath the surface there was something off. Something no one noticed until it was too late. It started with conversations after class. Innocent at first. Discussions about literature turned into discussions about life. Then came the text messages. "You have a rare mind, Hannah. I don't think anyone here understands you like I do." A compliment. A seed planted. Then more. "You ever feel like you're trapped in a place you don't belong? I think about leaving too. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just disappear." Hannah didn't realize it, but the boundaries between them were already crumbling. One night, he drove her home after a late study session. The car was parked outside her house, the engine humming softly in the dark. "I wish I had met you when I was younger," he murmured. Hannah's heart raced. A line had been crossed. She should have stepped out of the car. Should have ignored the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed. And from that moment, there was no going back. The relationship escalated quickly. Secret meetings. Late-night phone calls. Each time the risk grew greater, but so did the thrill. At first, Daniel was cautious. Careful. But obsession has a way of consuming logic. The first real scare came when a student, Emma Wilkes, saw them together at a diner just outside town. "Are you two dating?" Emma asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Daniel laughed it off, a smooth, practiced chuckle. "Just helping with an essay, Emma. Don't go starting rumors." Hannah smiled along, but her hands felt clammy. That night, Daniel texted her. "We need to be more careful. If people find out, we'll lose everything." But for Hannah, everything didn't seem like much to lose. Because to her, Daniel wasn't just a teacher. He was an escape. Then came the breaking point. One evening, as Hannah was leaving school, she overheard the principal speaking in hushed tones to another teacher. "Someone's been asking questions about Mr. Reeves." A parent filed a complaint. Hannah's stomach dropped. That night, she met Daniel at their usual spot, a secluded patch of woods behind an abandoned gas station. "They're on to us," she said breathlessly. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I won't let them take you from me." He gripped her shoulders. "Let's run." Hannah hesitated. "What?" "Let's leave this place. No one will understand us here. But out there? We can be free." She stared at him, searching his face for doubt. There was none. It sounded insane. Impossible. But the idea took root. She imagined it, escaping this town, starting over somewhere no one knew them. She should have said no. But instead she said yes. And in that moment, their fates were sealed. They packed their bags that night. Daniel withdrew cash, ditched his phone, and deleted every trace of their messages. By morning they were gone. No one saw them leave. No one knew where they were going. All they left behind was a town full of unanswered questions. And soon those questions would turn into headlines. Because by the time they were found, the only thing left to ask was, who pulled the trigger? By the time the town of Brookhaven realized Hannah Caldwell and Daniel Reeves had disappeared, they were already 3 states away. It started as whispers in the school hallways. Did she run away? Maybe she went to college early. Didn't she have a boyfriend? Maybe they left together. But by the end of the day, it wasn't just whispers. It was an investigation. Hannah's mother, Diane Caldwell, had always worried her daughter was too reckless, too independent. But when she entered her daughter's room that morning, she knew something was wrong. The bed was unmade. The closet half empty. The window slightly open. And on the desk, a single note. "Mom, don't worry. I'll be back. I just need to do this. I love you." Diane read the words over and over, her stomach twisting. She reached for her phone, dialing Hannah's number again, but just like before, voicemail. Something inside her snapped. She went straight to the school. Straight to the principal's office. "My daughter is missing," she said, her voice tight. The principal frowned. "I thought she was in class today?" Diane shook her head. "She never came home last night?" Something flickered across the principal's face. A hesitation. "What is it?" Diane demanded. "There's been concerns about Mr. Reeves," the principal admitted reluctantly. Diane froze. The name sent a chill down her spine. She had met Daniel Reeves once at a parent-teacher conference. She remembered thinking he was charming, maybe a little too much. But now, standing in the office, hearing his name in the same breath as her missing daughter, her stomach turned. The police were called within the hour. And within 24 hours, their disappearance was all over the news. A respected teacher and his student missing. Did she go willingly? Or was she taken? Meanwhile, on the road, Hannah and Daniel had no idea just how big the storm was growing behind them. The first 2 days were blissful. They drove for hours, stopping only when necessary, gas stations, fast food joints, cheap motels where no one asked questions. Hannah loved it. The thrill, the freedom, the feeling of doing something no one else dared to do. She and Daniel had always talked about escaping, but now it was real. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, he reached over and laced his fingers through hers. "We made it," he murmured. She smiled, resting her head against the seat. "We did?" But the reality of what they had done hadn't set in yet. Not until they stopped at a roadside diner somewhere in Nebraska. Hannah sat in the booth, stirring her milkshake when she heard it. Breaking news. A nationwide search is underway for missing teenager Hannah Caldwell and her former English teacher, Daniel Reeves. Authorities believe they may be on the run together. Her blood turned to ice. She glanced across the booth at Daniel. He had gone rigid, staring at the screen. Their faces were on the news. The waitress walked by, eyeing them suspiciously. Daniel grabbed Hannah's wrist. "We have to go." They left cash on the table and slipped out before anyone could ask questions. By the time they reached the car, Hannah was shaking. "It's real now," she whispered. Daniel gripped the steering wheel. "We'll be fine. We just have to stay ahead of them." But for the first time, Hannah wasn't so sure. Back in Brookhaven, the police were closing in. Detective Ethan Grayson, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades of experience, had been assigned to the case. And he didn't buy the love story. "These cases always start the same way," he muttered, flipping through the file. "Young girl. Older man. They think it's love, but it's something else." He scanned the timeline, his instincts already piecing the puzzle together. "He's been grooming her for months," he said, tapping a photo of Daniel's staff ID. "They don't just disappear overnight. This was planned." The chief nodded. "Her mother insists she was taken." "She wasn't," Grayson said flatly. "She went willingly." "Then why put out an Amber Alert?" the chief asked. Grayson sighed. "Because soon enough she's going to realize the truth. And by the time she does, it might be too late." That night, in a motel just outside Denver, Hannah stood by the bathroom sink, staring at herself in the mirror. Her phone had been taken apart, the SIM card snapped in half. There was no way to call home, no way to check the messages she knew were piling up. She took a deep breath, turning toward the bed. Daniel was lying there, scrolling through news articles on a burner phone. His face was tense, his jaw locked. She climbed into bed beside him, resting her head on his chest. "Are we going to be okay?" He kissed the top of her head. "Of course, baby. It's you and me against the world." Hannah closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. Because for the first time, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "What if this was a mistake?" The next morning, Daniel woke up first. He froze the second he saw the red and blue lights flashing through the motel curtains. "Police." His stomach dropped. They had been found. He shook Hannah awake. "Get up," he hissed. "We have to go. Now." Hannah's eyes widened as she heard the sound of heavy boots stomping toward their door. A voice boomed from outside. "Daniel Reeves. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." Hannah's heart pounded. This was it. The end. Or at least it should have been. But Daniel wasn't done running. He grabbed her wrist tight. "We're not going to prison," he whispered. "We leave now. Or we die together." Her breath caught in her throat. And before she could even react, he was reaching for the gun hidden in his bag. She had 1 second to decide. Run. Or die with him. The pounding on the motel door grew louder. The red and blue lights flashing through the curtains made the entire room feel like a war zone. Daniel Reeves. Open the door now? Hannah's heart slammed against her ribcage as she watched Daniel's fingers tighten around the grip of the gun. His knuckles were white, his breathing shallow. She had never seen him like this before. This is it, he muttered under his breath. They won't let us go. Hannah froze. She thought they had been running toward freedom, a new life, an escape. But the way he was gripping that gun, he wasn't running. He was preparing to die. And he wanted to take her with him. A terrifying realization hit her all at once. This wasn't love. It never had been. She had been trapped. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "Daniel, put the gun down." His head snapped toward her. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were cold now. "I won't go to prison," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I won't let them take you from me." The weight of those words crushed her. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't a love story. She had made a mistake. And if she didn't do something now, she wouldn't live long enough to regret it. Outside, Detective Ethan Grayson gripped his gun, signaling to his team to hold their positions. He had seen enough cases like this to know how they ended. And it was never pretty. He turned to one of the officers. "He's not coming out willingly. If we don't move fast, she'll end up in a body bag." The officer nodded. "Orders?" Grayson exhaled. "We go in." Inside the motel room, Hannah's mind raced. Daniel was distracted, his gaze flickering between the door and the gun in his hand. She had one chance. The moment his grip loosened for even a second, she lunged. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, shoving the gun away from his chest. It fired. A deafening explosion tore through the room. The gunshot shattered the motel mirror, glass spraying everywhere. Daniel stumbled back, stunned. Hannah ran. She barely made it 2 steps before he grabbed her hair, yanking her backwards with terrifying strength. She screamed. "You're not leaving me?" Daniel roared, his grip tightening. She thrashed, kicking, fighting for her life. And then, the door burst open. "Police! Drop the weapon!" Daniel spun around just as multiple guns were aimed at his head. His breathing was ragged. His fingers twitched around the trigger. And in that moment, Hannah knew what he was going to do. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't." But the look in his eyes told her it was already too late. A broken, hollow smile crossed his lips. "I told you we'd leave together." And then, he raised the gun to his own head. Hannah screamed. A final gunshot rang through the room. And Daniel Reeves was gone. The room fell into dead silence. The officers lowered their weapons. Grayson stepped forward cautiously, his eyes locking onto Hannah, who was curled up in the corner, shaking. She was covered in glass. In blood. But it wasn't hers. He holstered his gun and crouched beside her. "You're safe now." She barely nodded, her hands still pressed to her ears, as if she could still hear the gunshot ringing in her skull. Grayson studied her for a long moment. This girl, this kid, had been manipulated, stolen, brainwashed. And now, she was the only one left to tell the story. The next day the news broke. Teacher-student affair ends in tragic suicide. 18-year-old survivor speaks out. Brookhaven was in shock. Some blamed Daniel. Some blamed Hannah. Some called it a love story gone wrong. Others called it a crime. But only one thing was certain. The truth would haunt this town forever. And for Hannah Caldwell, the nightmare was far from over. Because some ghosts never die. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Hannah lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The white sheets felt sterile, cold. She had barely spoken since the motel. Since Daniel died. Since she realized everything she thought was love was a lie. Detective Ethan Grayson stood near the door, watching her carefully. He had seen trauma like this before, the kind that didn't fade with time. The kind that settled into your bones and never let go. "You're lucky to be alive," he finally said. Hannah didn't react. She just kept staring at the ceiling, blinking slowly as if she was somewhere else entirely. He tried again. "You know, there are people saying this was some kind of love story." That made her flinch. Grayson caught the movement. "Was it?" he asked gently. Hannah turned her head slowly, her eyes dull and distant. And then, for the first time in days, she spoke. "No." Her voice was hollow, barely a whisper. Grayson nodded. "Then tell me what it really was." Outside, the media circus was growing. Reporters swarmed the hospital, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into the faces of anyone who might have a piece of the story. Did she love him? Was she kidnapped? Did she help plan his escape? Should she be held responsible? People wanted answers. They wanted a villain. Some saw Daniel as the monster, a manipulative predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable girl. Others saw Hannah as the villain, a reckless teenager who had willingly run away with a man she knew she shouldn't be with. And then there were those who called it a tragedy, a love that was doomed before it ever had a chance. But Hannah knew the truth. It wasn't love. It was control. Detective Grayson sat across from her, pen tapping lightly against his notepad. "Tell me everything, Hannah. From the beginning?" She exhaled shakily. And then she began to talk. She told him about the first messages, the long stares in class, the way Daniel made her feel like she was different, special, chosen. The moment she first felt trapped. The red flags she ignored. The moment she realized she had lost control. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. Grayson closed his notebook. "You were groomed, Hannah. He made you believe you needed him. But it was never love." Tears burned in her eyes. She knew that now. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. "You're not the villain in this story," Grayson continued. "But you are the only one who can tell it." Hannah swallowed hard. For months, Daniel had controlled the narrative. He had shaped the way she saw the world. But now, she had a choice. She could let his version of events be the only one people ever heard. Or she could take back her voice. 2 days later, Hannah was released from the hospital. The world outside was waiting for her. The cameras, the reporters, the questions. She had a choice. Run from it. Hide. Let the world decide who she was. Or step forward. So she took a deep breath, walked outside and faced the cameras. "My name is Hannah Caldwell," she said, her voice steady. "And this is what really happened." The world held its breath. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Hannah was finally in control. The cameras flashed like lightning, blinding and relentless. Microphones were shoved into her face, voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of questions. "Hannah, were you in love with Daniel Reeves? Did you plan the escape together? Was he dangerous? Do you regret running away?" The world was waiting for her version of the story. For a long time, Hannah had let Daniel control the narrative. He had been the one whispering in her ear, shaping her thoughts, making her believe this was love. But now he was gone. And she wasn't afraid anymore. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. "My name is Hannah Caldwell," she said into the microphone, her voice steady. "And I want to set the record straight." The crowd fell silent. "I was never kidnapped," she admitted. "I left with him willingly." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. "But I didn't understand what was really happening. I didn't see the truth until it was too late. Daniel Reeves wasn't my savior. He wasn't my soulmate. He was a predator." The murmurs grew louder. Hannah took a deep breath. "He made me feel special. He made me believe that I was different. That the rules didn't apply to us. That what we had was real. But it was never love. It was manipulation. It was control." She saw the cameras zoom in, capturing every tremble in her voice, every flicker of emotion on her face. She let them. For the first time she was telling her own story. And the world was listening. The next morning the headlines had changed. "Survivor speaks out. The truth behind the teacher-student scandal." "Hannah Caldwell breaks silence. It was never love, it was grooming." The dark reality of manipulation. Hannah's story sparks nationwide conversation. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through article after article. Some people supported her. Some people still blamed her. Some said she was lying. That she had known exactly what she was doing. That she was just as responsible as Daniel. But she didn't care. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, she was free. 6 months later. Brookhaven had moved on, but Hannah never would. She still felt his presence sometimes, like a shadow lurking in the corners of her mind. His voice, his words, the way he made her feel like she belonged to him. But she was learning to take back her life. She started therapy. She spoke to other survivors. And eventually she started writing. A memoir. A story. Her truth. The book was titled, "The Lesson I'll Never Forget, Escaping the Grip of a Predator." And when it hit the shelves, people finally saw the story for what it really was. Not a romance. Not a tragedy. But a warning. One evening, Hannah sat by the window watching the sunset. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Detective Grayson. "I read your book. You did good, kid." She smiled. She had spent so long running from the past. But now, she was ready to face the future. And for the first time in a long time she felt hope. Hannah's story was one of manipulation, survival, and finding the strength to break free. But for every survivor who speaks out, there are still countless others who remain trapped. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous situation, seek help. Your story doesn't have to end like this. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who might be in a similar situation, speak up, reach out, and seek help. No one deserves to feel trapped, manipulated, or controlled. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Spread awareness. Share this video to help others recognize the warning signs. Learn more. Check the links in the description for resources on grooming, manipulation, and survivor support.